The sound wasn't loud, but in a room full of power, silence can be louder than anything. Emily Carter didn't fall immediately. She paused for a fraction of a second, as if her body refused to believe what had just happened, one hand instinctively moving to her 8-month belly, while the crystal lights above reflected in her unfocused eyes. And then she steadied herself against the edge of a marble table, the kind imported from Italy that her husband once said was worth more than most people's homes. Except tonight, none of that mattered because every gaze in that private Manhattan ballroom had shifted toward her, and none of them moved to help. Not one. 3 hours earlier, Emily had stood in front of a full-length mirror in their Upper East Side penthouse, smoothing the soft blue fabric over her stomach, whispering quietly that everything would be okay, that tonight was just another corporate gala, another performance of a life she had been trying to hold together piece by fragile piece, while behind her, the skyline stretched endlessly, glass, steel, and ambition. Everything Richard Hayes had built, everything she had believed they built together. Richard had entered the room without knocking. Already dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, his movements precise, efficient, like he was walking into a boardroom instead of his own home, his eyes barely landing on her before shifting to his watch. And when he did speak, it wasn't to ask how she felt or if the baby had been kicking like it had all afternoon, but to remind her, calmly, that tonight's investors were critical and that appearances mattered more than ever. Emily had nodded, because she always nodded, because over the past year she had learned that questions led to silence, and silence from Richard was colder than any argument. The drive to the gala had been quiet except for the low hum of the city passing by outside tinted windows. The driver focused straight ahead as though trained not to hear anything that might disrupt the illusion of perfection, and when they arrived, cameras flashed, doors opened, and Richard stepped out first, extending his hand just long enough for the photographers to capture what looked like devotion but felt like obligation. Inside, the ballroom glowed with warm gold light, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was, and Emily remembered thinking, just for a moment, that maybe she had been wrong, that maybe tonight would be different, that maybe the distance between them was just stress, just business, just something temporary that would pass once the baby arrived. But then she saw her, Vanessa Cole, standing across the room in a dress that caught every eye, her posture effortless, her smile precise, and the way she looked at Richard wasn't subtle. It wasn't hidden, it was confident, like someone who didn't need permission to belong. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the small clutch in her hand, not out of jealousy but recognition, because this wasn't the first time she had seen that look, just the first time it had been so impossible to ignore. Conversations blurred into background noise as Vanessa approached, her heels clicking softly against polished marble, each step measured, deliberate, and when she stopped in front of Emily, she didn't raise her voice, didn't create a scene. She simply tilted her head and smiled in a way that made everything else in the room feel distant, like the moment before a storm when the air changes but no one acknowledges it. Richard didn't intervene, didn't introduce, didn't even shift closer, and that silence, his silence, said more than any words could have, because in that moment Emily understood something she hadn't been ready to face, something that had been building quietly beneath the surface of their life together. Something that couldn't be explained away by business or stress or timing. And as the music continued to play and glasses clinked around them, she felt it settle deep in her chest, heavy and undeniable, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. Emily did not respond to Vanessa right away, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood something far more dangerous than words was unfolding in that moment. The kind of quiet shift that happens when truth stops hiding and begins to breathe on its own. And as the music carried on and conversations resumed around them in polite fragments, she noticed how no one truly looked at her anymore, as if the room itself had decided where she stood and adjusted accordingly. Vanessa's smile lingered just long enough to make its message clear before she turned slightly toward Richard, not touching him, not needing to, because proximity alone had already said everything, and Richard, in that controlled, measured way of his, simply adjusted his cufflinks as if this were all part of an expected evening, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if Emily were just another detail that did not require attention. For a moment, Emily considered walking away, disappearing into one of the quieter corners of the ballroom, finding a seat, catching her breath, pretending that this was something she could process later in the safety of silence. But the steady movement from within her reminded her that she was not alone, that every decision she made now carried more weight than it ever had before. And so instead of retreating, she straightened slightly, her shoulders pulling back not out of confidence but necessity. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, softer than she expected, yet steady enough to hold its place in the space between them. She addressed Richard, not Vanessa, asking a simple question that should have had a simple answer. And when he looked at her, there was no anger, no guilt, only a kind of distant calculation, as though he were evaluating how much truth the moment could tolerate without disrupting the image he had built so carefully over the years. He replied with something vague, something that sounded rehearsed, something that did not answer her at all, and that was when Emily felt it fully, not shock, not even sadness, but clarity, sharp and undeniable, the kind that leaves no room for doubt or excuses. Across the room, a group of investors laughed loudly, glasses raised, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the fracture happening just a few feet away, and the contrast made everything sharper. The warmth of the lighting, the polished surfaces, the carefully curated perfection that now felt almost artificial, like a stage set, designed to hold a story that no longer fit. Emily's grip tightened slightly around her clutch again, not out of fear this time, but grounding, a reminder that she was still present, still thinking, still capable of choosing what came next. And as she shifted her weight, she noticed a small detail she had missed earlier, a discreet security camera positioned high above the entrance arch, angled just enough to capture a wide view of the ballroom floor, its presence subtle but constant, recording everything without judgment or bias. And for reasons she could not fully explain, that detail settled something inside her, like a quiet reassurance that moments do not disappear simply because people choose not to acknowledge them. Vanessa said something then, light and dismissive, framed as casual conversation but carrying a tone that made its intention clear, and Richard allowed it, did not interrupt, did not correct, and that silence, repeated again, felt different now, not confusing but confirming. Emily inhaled slowly, the kind of breath she had practiced in quiet moments when the world felt too heavy, and as she exhaled she realized that whatever this night had been meant to be, it was no longer under his control alone, because truth, once seen, does not return to the shadows, and somewhere deep beneath the polished surface of the evening, something irreversible had already begun. Emily did not look away from Richard this time, and that alone seemed to shift something subtle in the air. Because for the first time that evening she was not reacting, she was observing, measuring the distance between what he said and what he allowed to happen around him, and the gap was no longer small enough to ignore. He gave a brief nod to someone across the room, already preparing to move on, to step back into the version of himself that investors trusted and admired. But Emily spoke again before he could leave, her voice still calm, yet carrying a firmness that did not belong to the quiet woman most people thought they knew. And it was not a confrontation, not raised, not emotional, just a simple request for clarity that hung in the space like a line no one else could see but everyone could feel. Richard paused, just for a second, and in that second Emily noticed something she had missed for months, the hesitation, small but real, the kind that only appears when control is not absolute. And he answered again with careful words, polished, strategic, designed to sound reasonable without revealing anything real. And it was then that Emily understood that this was not confusion anymore. This was design. This was a pattern built over time, reinforced through silence and distance and moments exactly like this one. Vanessa shifted slightly beside him, not impatient, not nervous, simply present, as if she already knew how this would end. And the certainty in that posture said more than any statement could have, because confidence like that does not come from hope. It comes from information. Across the ballroom, the lights reflected off glass and gold surfaces, creating a glow that softened every edge. But Emily felt the opposite, everything sharpening, details standing out with unexpected clarity. The faint reflection of the security camera lens catching a glint of light, the way a server paused just a moment longer than necessary, the subtle lowering of voices from nearby guests who were beginning to sense something without fully understanding it. Emily shifted her weight again, steadying herself, and as she did, she felt the small, steady movement from within, a reminder that whatever came next was not just about her dignity, but about the future she was responsible for protecting, and that realization grounded her in a way nothing else could. She glanced briefly toward the far end of the room where the entrance doors stood partially open, and for a moment she imagined walking through them, leaving everything behind, the expectations, the silence, the carefully constructed life that now felt more like a performance than a reality. But instead of moving, she returned her gaze to Richard, because leaving without understanding would only carry the same questions into a different space, and she was no longer willing to live inside unanswered truths. A nearby conversation rose slightly in volume, someone laughing too loudly, trying to reclaim the atmosphere, and it created a strange contrast, as if two different versions of the same evening were happening at once, one polished and effortless, the other quiet and irreversible. Emily's hand relaxed at her side, the tension easing not because the situation had improved, but because her perspective had shifted, and when she spoke again it was not to argue or accuse but to state something simple, something undeniable. And though her words were quiet, they carried a weight that made Richard finally look directly at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, and in his expression there was a flicker, brief and controlled, but enough for Emily to recognize it as the first crack in something he had always kept perfectly intact. Somewhere above them the camera continued its silent observation, capturing angles and moments no one else could hold on to. And Emily realized that truth does not need volume to exist. It only needs a moment where someone chooses not to look away, and as the music shifted into a slower rhythm and the evening continued around them, she understood that whatever happened next would not erase what had already been seen, because once clarity arrives, it does not leave quietly, it stays, waiting for the moment it is finally allowed to speak. Emily did not raise her voice, and that was what made people start paying attention, not immediately, not dramatically, but in the subtle way that a room shifts when something real begins to surface beneath layers of polished conversation. Richard's expression settled back into control, the brief crack gone as if it had never existed, and he adjusted his stance slightly, angling his body just enough to suggest the conversation was over. But Emily did not step back, and that alone disrupted the rhythm he depended on. Vanessa watched closely now, no longer pretending indifference, her eyes moving between them with quiet calculation, as if measuring how much longer the illusion could hold. Emily's gaze moved past them for just a moment, not in avoidance, but in awareness, taking in the room as it truly was, not as it had been presented to her, the investors, the partners, the carefully curated circle that had always seemed untouchable. And for the first time she realized how fragile it actually was, how dependent it was on perception rather than truth. A server passed nearby carrying a tray of untouched glasses, slowing slightly as he sensed the tension, then continuing on, trained to keep the flow intact no matter what unfolded in front of him. And that small detail stayed with her, the idea that systems like this were built to keep moving. Even when something inside them was breaking, Emily turned back to Richard and spoke again, not asking this time, but stating something simple, something grounded in what she had seen. And though her tone remained steady, there was no softness left in it, only clarity, and that clarity made it impossible to dismiss her as emotional or mistaken. Richard responded quickly, too quickly, his words layered with reason, with timing, with explanations that sounded structured but felt hollow. And Emily recognized the pattern now, not as defense, but as deflection, a strategy designed to maintain control without ever engaging with the truth itself. Vanessa shifted closer, not touching him, but standing within his space in a way that made the dynamic unmistakable, and the confidence in that movement confirmed what Emily had already understood, that this was not new, not recent, not something that had just begun. It had simply been hidden well enough to survive until now. Across the room, a few conversations quieted, not fully stopping but lowering just enough that the atmosphere changed, the polished surface of the evening beginning to ripple with awareness. And Emily could feel it, not as pressure but as presence, as if the room itself was beginning to acknowledge what had been ignored. She inhaled slowly again, grounding herself in the moment, in the steady rhythm within her, in the awareness that whatever came next would define more than just this evening. And when she spoke again, it was not directed at Vanessa, not even fully at Richard, but at the space between them, at the truth that now existed whether anyone chose to admit it or not. Her words were simple, measured, impossible to twist into something else, and for the first time, Richard did not immediately respond. Not because he had nothing to say, but because anything he said now would have to exist alongside what had already been seen, and that was something he could not fully control. Above them, the camera continued its quiet observation, capturing angles and details that no one in the room could erase, and Emily found herself oddly comforted by that. Not because she needed proof in that moment, but because it reminded her that reality does not depend on acknowledgment to exist. Vanessa's expression shifted slightly, just for a second, a flicker of something less certain beneath the confidence. And that was enough for Emily to understand that even those who seemed most secure were still relying on the same fragile structure of silence. The music changed again, softer now, almost distant. And as the evening continued around them, Emily realized that this was no longer about confrontation or explanation. It was about presence, about standing in a moment where truth had surfaced and choosing not to step away from it. And in that choice, something within her settled, not into comfort, but into certainty, the kind that does not need validation, only time. Emily noticed it before anyone said anything. The way the space around them no longer felt contained, as if the moment had expanded beyond the three of them and quietly reached the edges of the room, touching conversations, shifting attention, creating a subtle gravity that people could not fully ignore even if they tried. Richard sensed it too. She could tell by the way his posture adjusted, not dramatically, just enough to reclaim composure, to signal control, to remind the room who he was supposed to be in this setting. And for a second, he glanced toward the far side of the ballroom where a small group of senior partners stood watching with polite restraint, their expressions neutral but their awareness unmistakable. Emily followed that glance and understood instantly that this was no longer private, not in the way he preferred, and that realization did not make her anxious, it made her steady. Because truth exposed in silence carries a different kind of weight, one that cannot be dismissed as easily as words spoken in anger. Vanessa spoke again, lighter this time, almost conversational, as if attempting to dissolve the tension into something less defined, something that could be folded back into the evening without consequence. But the tone did not quite land the way it might have earlier, because now there was context, now there was awareness, and awareness changes everything. Emily turned slightly, not away from them, but enough to include the space around her, as if acknowledging that this moment belonged to more than just a private exchange. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet authority in it that had not been there before, not because she had gained power, but because she had stopped giving it away. She did not accuse, did not escalate. She simply named what was already visible, what no longer required interpretation. And the simplicity of it made it impossible to dismiss without also dismissing what others could now see for themselves. Richard responded. But this time there was a difference, a slight delay, a fraction of hesitation that disrupted the rhythm he usually controlled so precisely. And though his words were still measured, still composed, they carried less certainty, as if he were navigating a structure that no longer aligned perfectly beneath him. Emily felt the small movement within her again, steady and grounding, and she placed a hand lightly against her side, not out of distress, but connection. A reminder of what truly mattered beyond the room, beyond the performance, beyond the carefully constructed world that was beginning to show its limits. Near the entrance, a staff member adjusted something on a tablet, likely managing lighting or music cues, and for a brief second Emily wondered how many unseen systems were quietly recording, tracking, observing. How many layers existed beyond what anyone acknowledged out loud. And that thought settled into her mind with a strange sense of reassurance, because it meant this moment was not as fragile as it appeared. Vanessa's expression tightened just slightly again, not enough for most to notice, but Emily saw it clearly now, the shift from confidence to calculation, the awareness that control was no longer absolute. that the narrative could not be shaped as easily as before. A couple standing nearby paused their conversation entirely, their attention no longer disguised, and though no one stepped closer, the distance between observer and participant had narrowed, and Emily realized that the room was no longer neutral. It was becoming a witness. She took a slow breath, letting the moment settle fully, and when she spoke again, it was softer, but more decisive. Not a question, not a challenge, just a clear statement that drew a line without needing to raise it. And for the first time, Richard did not immediately counter, did not redirect, did not move past it. He simply held her gaze. And in that stillness, something shifted irreversibly, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to signal that whatever had been hidden was no longer fully contained. And that from this point forward, every step would exist in the presence of what had already been seen. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure. And Emily realized that this was the moment where everything could still be reshaped, not by force, not by volume, but by what was allowed to stand unchallenged. And she understood now that she no longer needed to push, because what had already surfaced was enough. Richard shifted his weight again, his attention flickering briefly toward the watching partners before returning to her. And for the first time, there was something else beneath his composure, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the recognition that control was no longer complete, that this situation could not be neatly redirected without consequence. Vanessa, standing just slightly behind him now, adjusted her posture with the kind of subtle precision that suggested she was recalibrating, her confidence still present but no longer effortless, as though she too could feel the balance of the room shifting in a direction she had not fully anticipated. Emily did not move closer, did not retreat. She simply remained exactly where she was, grounded in the center of a moment that no longer belonged to anyone else's narrative. And when she spoke again, it was quieter than before, but sharper, each word placed with intention, not to provoke, but to clarify, to define what had already been revealed in a way that could not be undone by explanation or distraction. Somewhere behind her, a glass was set down too quickly, the small sound cutting through the background noise just enough to draw a few more glances in their direction. And with each passing second, the illusion of privacy dissolved further, replaced by a collective awareness that something real was unfolding in a space designed to prevent exactly that. Emily's hand rested lightly against her side again, a steady, grounding gesture, and she let herself feel the moment fully, not the embarrassment she might have once felt, not the confusion that had defined the past months, but a clear, unwavering understanding that what she had been holding onto was no longer there. And that realization, instead of weakening her, settled into something solid. Something that did not depend on his response or anyone else's reaction. Richard finally spoke again, slower this time, his tone still controlled, but carrying an edge of urgency beneath it, as if he were attempting to close something that could no longer be contained, offering words that sounded like resolution but lacked substance, and Emily recognized it instantly. The attempt to move forward without addressing what had already been exposed. She listened, not interrupting, not reacting, and when he finished, she allowed a brief pause, just long enough for the weight of what had been said to register in the space around them. And then she answered, not with argument, not with emotion, but with a single statement that aligned completely with what the room had already begun to understand. Vanessa's expression shifted again, more noticeable this time, her certainty interrupted by something she could not fully mask. And for the first time, she did not immediately follow with a comment, did not attempt to redirect the tone, because there was nothing left to reshape without directly confronting the truth itself. Near the entrance, one of the event coordinators hesitated before stepping forward to adjust the flow of guests, as though unsure whether to intervene or allow the moment to resolve on its own. And that hesitation reflected the entire room, a collective pause where no one quite knew what came next, but everyone understood that something had changed. Emily exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders, not because the situation had resolved, but because she no longer needed it to. And as she held Richard's gaze one last time, she saw it clearly, the difference between who he was in front of others and who he had been behind closed doors. And more importantly, she saw that the distance between those two versions was no longer hidden. Above them, the camera remained fixed, silent, and steady, capturing a moment that did not require sound to be understood, and Emily realized that sometimes the most decisive shift does not come from confrontation but from clarity, from standing still in a truth that no longer needs permission to exist. And in that stillness, everything that once felt uncertain finally became simple. No one announced it, but the room had already chosen a side, not openly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way people begin to listen more carefully, to watch more closely, to reassess what they thought they understood, and Emily could feel it in the stillness that followed her last words, a stillness that did not belong to her alone anymore. Richard noticed it too, his gaze shifting briefly across the room again, this time lingering just a fraction longer on the partners whose approval had always defined his world. And for the first time that evening his confidence did not return immediately. It paused, recalculated, as if something fundamental had slipped beyond his reach. Vanessa straightened slightly, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless, and she attempted once more to soften the moment with a remark that sounded light on the surface. Yet the response it received was different now, thinner, less convincing, as though the room itself had stopped accepting the version of events she was offering. Emily did not respond to Vanessa at all, not because she was avoiding her, but because she understood that the center of this moment was no longer a triangle. It was a shift, a redefinition of what was real and what had been maintained through silence. And her focus remained on Richard, not as a challenge, but as a final point of recognition. She stepped back half a pace, not retreating but creating space, and that small movement changed everything, because it signaled that she was no longer standing there to be explained away. She was standing there to leave on her own terms. The music continued, softer now, almost distant, and conversations began to resume in fragments. But the tone had changed, the ease replaced by something more cautious, more aware, as if everyone present understood that the evening would be remembered for more than its intended purpose. Emily glanced once more toward the entrance, toward the open doors that led back to the city lights. And this time the thought of leaving did not feel like escape. It felt like direction, like the next step in something that had already begun. Richard spoke again, calling her name, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a note that had not been there before, something closer to urgency than control, yet even that carried the same structure, the same attempt to contain what could no longer be contained. And Emily listened without turning back immediately, giving the moment space to exist exactly as it was, uncorrected, unpolished. When she finally did turn, her expression was calm, almost still, and she said something simple, something that did not accuse or explain, but closed the distance between what had been hidden and what was now visible. And though her voice did not rise, it carried across the space in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Vanessa did not speak this time, her silence more telling than anything she could have added, and Richard held Emily's gaze for a moment longer before looking away, just briefly, but enough. Enough for anyone paying attention to understand that the balance had shifted. Emily exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something clear and steady, and without another word she turned toward the exit, her steps measured, unhurried, not because she was unsure, but because she was certain that leaving now was not a loss but a decision. And as she moved through the room the space parted just slightly, not dramatically, but enough to allow her through without obstruction, as if even those who had remained silent understood that something had ended and something else had begun. Above it all, the camera remained fixed, recording not just the moment she left, but the moment before it, the moment where everything changed without a single raised voice. And as the doors closed quietly behind her, the sound was almost imperceptible, yet in that silence, an entire world shifted out of alignment. The night air felt different the moment Emily stepped outside, not colder, not warmer, just real in a way the ballroom had not been. And for the first time in months she inhaled without measuring the weight of someone else's expectations, her hand resting lightly against her side as the distant sound of the city moved around her, steady, indifferent, alive. Behind her, the doors remained closed, holding inside them the version of her life that had just shifted beyond repair. And yet she did not turn back, not even once, because there was nothing left in that room that required her presence to validate it. A black sedan idled near the curb, the driver already stepping forward with quiet professionalism. But Emily paused before moving, allowing herself a moment to feel the transition, not as an ending, but as a boundary crossed, one she could not return from even if she wanted to. Inside the ballroom, the evening continued, but not as it had before. Conversations carried on with a careful tone, glances exchanged more frequently, and though no one would say it directly, the memory of what had just unfolded lingered in every interaction, subtle but persistent, like a thread that could not be removed. Richard remained where she left him for longer than he intended, his attention no longer fully anchored to the event he had spent months preparing, because something had shifted that he could not immediately repair. And while he eventually resumed his role, speaking, greeting, maintaining composure, the rhythm was not the same. The precision slightly off, as if each movement now carried the awareness of being observed beyond his control. Vanessa stayed close, her presence still confident, but no longer unquestioned, her words more measured, her tone adjusted, because even she could feel that the space they occupied had changed, that certainty once taken for granted had become something that needed to be maintained rather than assumed. Above them, the security camera continued its silent recording, capturing not only the earlier moment but everything that followed, the subtle shifts, the altered dynamics, the quiet recognition passing between people who had witnessed more than they expected. Outside, Emily finally moved toward the car, her steps steady, unhurried, and as she reached the door she paused again, not out of doubt, but because a new thought had settled into her mind, clear and undeniable, that what happened inside that room did not end when she walked out. It followed, not as something to haunt her, but as something to define what came next. She slid into the back seat, the door closing softly behind her, and as the car pulled away from the curb the city lights reflected across the window, shifting with each passing block, a quiet reminder that movement itself was a form of decision, that leaving was not an absence but an action. Her phone rested beside her, silent for now, but she knew that silence would not last, that messages would come, explanations, attempts to reframe what had happened, to soften it, to redirect it. But none of that would change what she had already seen, what she had already understood. The driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, not intruding, just confirming direction, and Emily gave a small nod, her gaze returning to the passing skyline, where glass towers reflected one another in endless repetition, a world built on image and perception, and yet beneath it all, something else existed, something quieter, more grounded, something she had finally chosen to stand within, miles away from the ballroom. The night continued as it always did, but for Emily, the distance growing between her and that room was not just physical, it was definitive, a separation that did not require explanation, only acknowledgment. And as the car merged into the steady flow of traffic, she allowed herself one final thought, simple and steady, that some truths do not need to be announced to change everything. They only need to be seen, and once they are, nothing returns to what it was before. The car slowed as it approached a quiet intersection, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead, and Emily realized that for the first time in years, she was not thinking about what came next in his world. She was thinking about what came next in hers, and that difference, subtle as it seemed, felt like stepping into a space that had always existed but had never been fully hers to stand in. Her phone lit up softly beside her, the screen illuminating with a name she had seen thousands of times before, but now it felt distant, almost unfamiliar, and she let it ring once, twice, before the sound faded into silence again, not out of hesitation, but out of certainty, because whatever words were waiting on the other side of that call belonged to a version of her life that had already shifted beyond recognition. The driver adjusted the route slightly, navigating through late-night traffic with practiced ease, and Emily watched the movement outside the window, people crossing streets, taxis, pulling over, life continuing without pause, and it grounded her in a way that felt steady, reminding her that the world does not stop for a single moment, no matter how significant it feels from within. Behind her, miles away, the ballroom had returned to its rhythm, but not its balance, because something had been seen that could not be unseen. Conversations would continue, business would proceed, but the narrative that once held everything in place had been quietly disrupted, and Richard knew it, even if he had not yet decided what to do with it. His phone would ring, messages would arrive, questions framed carefully but carrying unmistakable weight, and though he would answer with the same precision he always had, something in those exchanges would feel different, because control, once fractured, does not return in the same form. Vanessa would remain close, adjusting, recalibrating, maintaining the image as best as possible. But even she would feel the shift, the difference between standing within a story and standing within its consequences. In the back seat of the car, Emily rested her head lightly against the window, the cool glass grounding her in the present, and she allowed the quiet to settle around her, not as emptiness, but as space to think, to breathe, to recognize that what she had just walked away from was not simply a moment. It was a pattern, one that had shaped her decisions, her silence, her understanding of herself for longer than she had realized. Her hand moved again to her side, a familiar gesture now, and she closed her eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in clarity, because beneath everything that had happened, there was something simple and undeniable, something that did not require proof or validation, only acknowledgment. And she had finally given herself that. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softening slightly, and as the distance from the ballroom grew, so did the separation between who she had been and who she was becoming, not through dramatic change, not through sudden transformation, but through a single decision repeated in real time, the decision to see clearly and to act accordingly. Her phone remained silent now, the earlier call unanswered, and she knew there would be more explanations, attempts to redefine the moment, to place it back into a narrative that made sense for everyone else. But she also knew that none of it would change what had already been understood, because truth does not depend on agreement to exist. The car came to a smooth stop outside her building, the familiar facade rising quietly in front of her, and as the driver stepped out to open the door, Emily took one final breath before moving, not because she needed courage, but because she recognized the significance of the step she was about to take, not away from something, but towards something that had been waiting for her to claim it. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, the night air steady and real, and as the door closed behind her, there was no sound of finality, no dramatic ending, only the quiet continuation of a life that had shifted direction without needing to announce it. Because sometimes the most powerful changes do not echo, they settle, deep and lasting, shaping everything that follows in ways that only become visible with time.